Everything takes much longer than he expects. The task of emptying 3 rooms, practically empty to begin with, leaves him exhausted. He is surprised to see how many garbage bags he has managed to fill up, how many trips up and down the stairs he has had to make. By the time he is finished, it is already beginning to get dark. He has a list with him of the people he has to call before the business day is over. Call rental office, call university, cancel utilities. "We are so very sorry," he is told by a series of people he has never met. "We just saw him Friday," one of his father's colleagues says. What a shock it must be. The rental office tells him not to worry, that they will send someone by to remove the couch and the bed. When he finishes, he drives through town to the dealer who leased his father the car, and then he takes a cab back to Baron's Court. In the lobby, he notices a menu for pizza delivery. He orders a pizza, calls home as he waits for it to arrive. For an hour the line is busy. By the time he gets through, his mother and Sonia are both asleep. A friend of the family informs him. The house is filled with noise, and it is only then that he recognizes how quiet it is on his end. He considers going back down to the basement to get the tape player or the television. Instead, he calls Maxine, describing the details of his day, amazed to think she had been with him at the beginning of it, that it was in her arms, in her bed, that he had woken. "I should have come with you," she says. "I could still make it out there by morning." "I'm finished. There's nothing else to do. I'm taking the first flight back tomorrow." "You're not going to spend the night there, are you, Nick?" she asks him. "I have to. There aren't any other flights tonight." "In the apartment, I mean." He feels defensive. After all his efforts, he feels protective of the 3 empty rooms. "I don't know anyone here." "For God's sake, get out of there. Check yourself into a hotel." "Okay," he says. He thinks of the last time he had seen his father, 3 months ago, the image of him waving goodbye as he and Maxine pulled out of the driveway, on their way to New Hampshire. He cannot remember the last time he and his father had spoken. 2 weeks ago? 4? His father was not one to make frequent phone calls the way his mother does. "You were with me," he tells her. "What?" "The last time I saw my father, you were there." "I know. I'm so sorry, Nick. Just promise me you'll go to a hotel." "Yeah, I promise." He hangs up and opens the phone book, looking at his choices of places to stay. He is accustomed to obeying her, to taking her advice. He dials one of the numbers. "Good evening, how may I help you?" a voice inquires. He asks if there are any rooms available for the night, but while he is on hold, he hangs up. He doesn't want to inhabit an anonymous room. As long as he is here, he doesn't want to leave his father's apartment empty. He lies on the couch in the dark, in his clothes, his body covered by his jacket, preferring that to the stripped mattress in the room. For hours he lies in the dark, falling in and out of sleep. He thinks of his father in the apartment just yesterday morning. What had he been doing when he had begun to feel badly? Was he at the stove making tea? Sitting on the sofa where Gogol sits now? Gogol imagines his father by the door, bending over to tie his shoelaces for the last time, putting on his coat and scarf and driving to the hospital, stopping at a traffic light, listening to the weather report on the radio. The thought of death absent from his mind. Eventually, Gogol is aware of bluish light creeping into the room. He feels strangely vigilant, as if, were he to pay close enough attention, some sign of his father might manifest itself, putting a stop to the events of the day. He watches the sky whiten, listens as the perfect silence is replaced by the faintest hum of distant traffic, until suddenly he succumbs, for a few hours, to the deepest sleep possible, his mind blank and undisturbed, his limbs motionless, weighted down. It is nearly 10 in the morning when he wakes up again, unobstructed sunlight brightening the room. A dull, steady ache persists on the right side of his head, emanating from deep inside his skull. He opens the sliding glass door to the balcony and stands outside. His eyes burn from fatigue. He gazes at the man-made pond, which his father had told Gogol during a phone conversation he walked around 20 times each evening before eating his dinner, that it equaled a distance of 2 miles. A few people are out there now, walking their dogs, couples exercising side by side, swinging their arms, thick fleece bands covering their ears. Gogol puts on his coat, goes outside and attempts to walk around the pond once. At first, he welcomes the cold air on his face, but the chill turns brutal, unforgiving, slicing through his body and pressing the backs of his pants against his legs, and so he returns to the apartment. He takes a shower, changing into the same clothes he had worn the day before. He calls himself a cab and goes to the basement one last time to throw away the towel he had used to dry off, the grey push-button phone. He is taken to the airport, boards a flight to Boston. Sonia and his mother will be there, along with a few friends of the family, waiting for him at the arrival gate. He wishes it could be otherwise. He wishes he could simply get into another cab and ride along another highway, deferring the moment he must face them. He is terrified to see his mother, more than he had been to see his father's body in the morgue. He knows now the guilt that his parents carried inside, at being able to do nothing when his parents had died in India, of arriving weeks, sometimes months later, when there was nothing left to do. On the way to Cleveland, the journey had felt endless, but this time, staring out the plane window, seeing nothing, all too quickly he feels the plane's descent in his chest. Just before landing, he goes into the bathroom, reaches into the tiny metal basin. He rinses his face and looks at himself in the mirror. Apart from a day's growth on his face, he looks exactly the same. He remembers when his paternal grandfather died, sometime in the 70s. Remembers his mother screaming when she walked in on his father, who was shaving off all his hair with a disposable razor. In the process, his scalp had bled in numerous places, and for weeks he had worn a cap to work to hide the scabs. "Stop it, you're hurting yourself," his mother had said. His father had shut the door and locked it, and emerged shrunken and bald. Years later, Gogol had learned the significance, that it was a Bengali son's duty to shave his head in the wake of a parent's death. But at the time Gogol was too young to understand. When the bathroom door opened, he had laughed at the sight of his hairless, grief-stricken father, and Sonia, just a baby, had cried. For the first week, they are never alone. No longer a family of 4, they become a household of 10, sometimes 20, friends coming by to sit with them quietly in the living room, their heads bent, drinking cups of tea, a cluster of people attempting to make up for his father's loss. His mother has shampooed the vermilion from her part. She has taken off her iron wedding bracelet, forcing it from her hand with a cold cream, along with all the other bracelets she has always worn. Cards and flowers come continually to the house from his father's colleagues at the university, from the women who work with his mother at the library, from neighbors who normally do little but wave from their lawns. People call from the West Coast, from Texas, from Michigan, and D.C. All the people in his mother's address book, always added to, never crossed out, all of them are stricken by the news. Who had forsaken everything to come to this country, to make a better life, only to die here? The phone rings constantly, and their ears ache from speaking to all these people, their throats turning weak from explaining again and again. "No, he wasn't ill," they say. "Yes, it was completely unexpected." A short obituary runs in the town paper, citing the names of Ashima and Gogol and Sonia, mentioning that the children had been educated at the local schools. In the middle of the night, they call their relatives in India. For the first time in their lives, it's they who have bad news to bear. For 10 days following his father's death, he and his mother and Sonia eat a mourner's diet, foregoing meat and fish. They eat only rice and dal and vegetables, plainly prepared. Gogol remembers having to do the same thing when he was younger, when his grandparents died, his mother yelling at him when he forgot one day and had a hamburger at school. He remembers, back then, being bored by it, annoyed at having to observe a ritual no one else he knew followed, in honor of people he had seen only a few times in his life. He remembers his father sitting unshaven on a chair, staring through them, speaking to no one. He remembers those meals eaten in complete silence, the television turned off. Now, sitting together at the kitchen table at 6:30 every evening, the hour feeling more like midnight through the window, his father's chair empty. This meatless meal is the only thing that seems to make sense. There is no question of skipping this meal. On the contrary, for 10 evenings, the three of them are strangely hungry, eager to taste the baldness on their plates. It is the one thing that structures their days. The sound of the food being warmed in the microwave, 3 plates lowered from the cupboard, 3 glasses filled. The rest of it, the calls, the flowers that are everywhere, the visitors, the hours they spend sitting together in the living room, unable to say a word, mean nothing. Without articulating it to one another, they draw comfort from the fact that it is the only time in the day that they are alone, isolated, as a family, even if there are visitors lingering in the house. Only the 3 of them partake of this meal, and only for its duration is their grief slightly abated, the enforced absence of certain foods on their plates conjuring his father's presence somehow. On the 11th day, they invite their friends to mark the end of the mourning period. There is a religious ceremony conducted on the floor in one corner of the living room. Gogol is asked to sit in front of a picture of his father as a priest chants verses in Sanskrit. Before the ceremony, they had spent a whole day looking for a picture to frame, going through albums. But there are almost no pictures of his father alone. His father, who was forever behind the lens. They decide to crop one of him and Ashima standing together years ago in front of the sea. He is dressed like a New Englander, in a parka and a scarf. Sonia takes it to CVS to have it enlarged. They prepare an elaborate meal, fish and meat, bought one bitterly cold morning in Chinatown and Haymarket, cooked as his father liked them best, with extra potatoes and fresh coriander leaves. When they shut their eyes, it's as if it is just another party. The house smelling of food. All those years of entertaining have prepared them, somehow. Ashima frets that there will not be enough rice. Gogol and Sonia take people's coats and put them upstairs, on the guest room bed. The friends his parents have collected for almost 30 years are in attendance to pay their respects. Cars from 6 different states lining the whole of Pemberton Road. Maxine drives up from New York, bringing Gogol the clothes he normally keeps at her house, his laptop, his mail. His bosses have given him a month off from work. It's a bit of a shock to see Maxine, to introduce her to Sonia. This time he doesn't care how the pile of guests' shoes heaped by the doorway might appear to her eyes. He can tell that she feels useless, a bit excluded in this house full of Bengalis, and yet he doesn't bother to translate what people are saying, to introduce her to everyone, to stay close by her side. "I'm so sorry," he hears her say to his mother, aware that his father's death does not affect Maxine in the least. "You guys can't stay with your mother forever," Maxine says when they are alone for a moment after the ceremony, upstairs in his room, sitting side by side on the edge of the bed. "You know that." She says it gently, puts her hand to his cheek. He stares at her, takes her hand and puts it back in her lap. "I miss you, Nikhil." He nods. "What about New Year's Eve?" she says. "What about it?" "Do you still want to try to go up to New Hampshire?" For they had talked of this, going away together, just the two of them, Maxine picking him up after Christmas, staying at the lake house. Maxine was going to teach him how to ski. "I don't think so." "It might do you good," she says, tilting her head to one side. She glances around the room. "To get away from all this." "I don't want to get away." In the weeks that follow, as their neighbors' hedges and windows are decorated with strings of colored lights, as piles of Christmas cards arrive at the house, each of them assumes a task his father normally had done. In the mornings his mother goes to the mailbox and brings in the paper. Sonia drives into town and does the weekly grocery shopping. Gogol pays the bills, shovels the driveway when it snows. Instead of arranging the Christmas cards on the fireplace mantel, Ashima glances at the return addresses and then, without opening the envelopes, she throws them away. Each small event seems like an enormous accomplishment. His mother spends hours on the phone and has all the names changed on the bank account, the mortgage, the bills. She is unable to stem the tide of junk mail that will continue to arrive for years, addressed to her dead husband. In the wan, dreary afternoons, Gogol goes running. Sometimes he drives to the university, parking behind his father's department, running along the campus roads through the confined, picturesque universe that had been his father's world for most of the past 25 years. Eventually, on weekends, they begin to visit the homes of their parents' friends who live in surrounding suburbs. Gogol drives one way, Sonia the other. Ashima sits in the back seat. At the homes of their friends, his mother tells the story of calling the hospital. "He went in for a stomachache," she says each time, reciting the details of the afternoon, the pink streaks that had been in the sky, the pile of cards, the cup of tea at her side, reciting it the way that Gogol cannot bear to have repeated, a way he quickly comes to dread. Friends suggest she go to India, see her brother and her cousins for a while, but, for the first time in her life, Ashima has no desire to escape to Calcutta. Not now. She refuses to be so far from the place where her husband made his life, the country in which he died. "Now I know why he went to Cleveland," she tells people, refusing, even in death, to utter her husband's name. "He was teaching me how to live alone." Early in January, after holidays, they don't celebrate, in the first days of a year that his father does not live to see. Gogol boards a train and goes back to New York. Sonia is staying on with Ashima, thinking of getting an apartment in Boston or Cambridge so that she will be nearby. They come to the station to see him off, standing on the platform in the cold, his diminished family straining but failing to see Gogol, who waves at them through the tinted glass. He remembers them all coming to see him off each time in his first year of college. He would head back to Yale. And, though over the years his departures had become mundane, his father would always stand on the platform until the moment the train was out of sight. Now Gogol raps his knuckles on the windows, but the train begins to move, as his mother and Sonia are still struggling to spot him. The train rattles forward, jostles from side to side, its engine making a sound like the propeller of a plane. The whistle blares intermittently in a minor key. He sits on the left side of the train, the winter sunlight strong on his face. Instructions for removing the window in the event of an emergency, in 3 steps, are pasted to the glass. Snow covers the straw-colored ground. Trees stand like spears, dried copper leaves from the previous season still clinging to a few of the branches. He sees the backs of houses made of brick and wood, small snowy lawns. A solid shelf of winter clouds stops just short of the horizon. More snow, possibly heavy, is expected by evening. He hears a young woman somewhere in the compartment talking to her boyfriend on a cell phone, softly laughing. She talks about where they should meet for dinner once she gets into the city. "I'm so bored," she complains. Gogol will arrive in New York in time for dinner as well. Maxine will be there to greet him at Penn Station, something she has never bothered to do in the past, waiting for him under the arrivals and departures board. The landscape jerks forward, falls away, the train casting a passing shadow on an expanse of nondescript buildings. The tracks resemble endless ladders that stretch ahead rather than upward, rooted to the ground. Between Westerly and Mystic, the tracks are at an angle, embedded into the sloping land, so that the whole train threatens, ever so slightly, to topple over. Though the other passengers seldom comment on this, the way they do, for example, when the engine changes at New Haven from diesel to electric with a sudden jolt. This momentary shift never fails to rouse Gogol from his nap, or the book he is reading, or the conversation he is engaged in, or the thought that has gathered in his head. The train tilts to the left, heading south to New York, to the right on the way to Boston. In the brief period of suggested peril, he thinks always of the other train he has never seen, the one that had nearly killed his father, of the disaster that has given him his name. The train rights itself. The angle falls behind. Again he feels its motion at the small of his back. For several miles the tracks hug the ocean, which is close enough to touch the shallowest waves, lap against mere inches of shore. He sees a stone bridge, scattered islands the size of rooms, gracious grey and white homes with pleasant views, boxy houses built on silts, lone herons and cormorants perch on bleached wooden posts. Boats with naked masts crowd the marina. It is a view his father would have appreciated, and Gogol is reminded of the many times he had driven with his family on cold Sunday afternoons to the sea. There were times when it had been so cold that they had simply sat in the car in the parking lot, looking at the water, his parents sharing tea from a thermos in front seat, the engine running to keep them warm. Once they had gone to Cape Cod, driving along that curving piece of land until they could drive no farther. He and his father had walked to the very tip across the breakwater, a string of giant grey slanted stones, and then, on the narrow, final inward crescent of sand, his mother had stopped after a few stones and waited with Sonia, too young to go with them, at her side. "Don't go too far," his mother had warned. "Don't go so that I can't see you." His legs began to ache halfway there, but his father marched ahead, stopping at times to lend Gogol an arm, his body slightly tilted when he rested on a rock. While on these rocks, some far apart enough to make them pause and consider the best way to reach the next one, water had surrounded them on both sides. It was early winter. Ducks swam in the tide pools. The waves flowed in two directions. "He's too little," his mother had called out. "Are you listening? He's too little to go so far." Gogol had stopped then, thinking that perhaps his father would agree. "What do you say?" his father had said instead. "Are you too little?" "No, I didn't think so." At the end of the breakwater there was a field of yellow reeds to the right, and dunes beyond, and the ocean behind it all. He had expected his father to turn back, but still they had continued, stepping onto the sand. They walked along the water to the left, heading towards the lighthouse, past rusted boat frames, fish spines as thick as pipes attached to yellow skulls, a dead gull whose feathery white breast was freshly stained with blood. They began to pick up small, faded black stones with white stripes running around them, stuffing them into their pockets so that they dropped on either side. He remembers his father's footprints in the sand because of his limp. The right toe of his shoe was always turned outwards, the left straight ahead. Their shadows that day were unnaturally slender and long, leaning in towards each other, the late afternoon sun at their backs. They paused to regard a kraken wooden buoy painted blue and white, shaped like an old parasol. The surface was wrapped with thin brown strands of seaweed and encrusted with barnacles. His father lifted and inspected it, pointing to a live mussel underneath. Finally they stood by the lighthouse, exhausted, surrounded by water on three sides, pale green in the harbour, azure behind. Overheated from the exertion, they unzipped their coats. His father stepped away to urinate. He heard his father cry out that they had left the camera with his mother. "All the way and no picture," he had said, shaking his head. He reached into his pocket and began to throw the striped stones into the water. "We will have to remember it, then." They looked around at the grey and white town that glowed across the harbour. Then they started back again, for a while trying not to make an extra set of footsteps, inserting their shoes into the ones they had just made. A wind had picked up, so strong that it forced them to stop now and then. "Will you remember this day, Gogol?" his father had asked, turning back to look at him, his hands pressed like earmuffs to either side of his head. "How long do I have to remember it?" Over the rise and fall of the wind, he could hear his father's laughter. He was standing there waiting for Gogol to catch up, putting out a hand as Gogol drew near. "Try to remember it always," he said once Gogol had reached him, leading him slowly back across the breakwater to where his mother and Sonia stood waiting. "Remember that you and I made this journey, that we went together to a place where there was nowhere left to go."